All right. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this research project as part of the doctoral dissertation titled Social Inclusion and Participation in the Design of the Post-2015 Agenda, now known as Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Your role and experience in the post-2015 process will provide significant input about the level of social inclusion of this development process. So, hello again, Paul. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you could tell us about yourself.
So my name is Paul Ladd. I currently work in Geneva as the director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development. For the last 10 years, I was in UNDP, most recently as the director for the post-2015 team.
Thank you, Paul. In your opinion, what is the value or importance of social inclusion and participation during the design of the post-2015 development agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, I'm not quite sure how you differentiate between social inclusion and participation, but let me concentrate on participation. One of the reasons that many of us in the UN across the agencies decided to put in place a structure and mechanism for participation in the design of the new agenda was simply because it's the right thing to do. You know, if you're going to attempt to put together goals and targets and a global agenda that is intended to make people's lives better, then you really should ask them how their lives can be made better. You don't put out a product on the market without going and doing market research. You don't get a government voted in unless you know what they're trying to sell to you and you vote them in or not. And it's the same for the development process. If we're going to put together goals on health and education and jobs and everything else, then we should ask people whether these are the things that will make their lives better or not. So the first thing is it's the right thing to do. The second thing is it's really the best thing to do because it's more efficient. You're actually responding and allocating resources to things that people think are more important, and therefore you're using resources in a better way. So that's why I think participation is important. And then depending on how you define social inclusion, and we can see if that's different or not, but
Thank you. And so how was
I can't hear you, Juan.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Paul. So how has social participation influenced the post-2015 process, and what mechanisms do you think were the most important to you?
So participation again, right? Participation of people. That's what I'm broadly interpreting the questions as.
Yes, that's fine.
So what mechanisms have been most important? I really think this sort of mixed methods approach to actually getting people engaged was the most effective. So on the one hand, as you're aware, the UN and many others outside the UN set up face-to-face meetings at all levels with policymakers, with business, with poor and vulnerable groups themselves, with people who work in the development sort of business. And so those face-to-face meetings can yield a lot of information and insights that you don't get in simpler tools. Because people use different words to mean different things. They have different cultures that underpin how they present themselves, different values. So face-to-face contact for participation is really, really important. But of course, as you also know, the UN and others pursued other techniques to elicit people's contributions and views, whether that's from analysing their social media interactions on Twitter or on Facebook, or in the case of the My World survey, by having a more closed, parameterised survey to ask people what they care about. And as I argued at the time, it's not about one thing being right or about one thing having the whole truth or being better than the other technique. It's about what you can infer from all of these together. And in fact, whether you can triangulate the same results from using those different mechanisms. So I think all of them all of the ones that we used in the end in the design process brought something to the table and gave us information that was useful either in content terms or politically in terms of supporting the overall process.
So in your view, was the design of the post-2015 agenda an inclusive process? And what evidence do you think it's there?
Well, the design of the post-2015 process, remembering that it was at the multilateral level, I am absolutely sure is the most inclusive multilateral process that the world has ever seen. Now, was it inclusive? I think yes, to some degree. And you're aware we're doing an evaluation of our own project in this area. I think with a limited basket of resources, then it's very, very difficult to reach down into some of the excluded and marginalized communities in sufficient sort of number at sufficient scale. So in that category is everything from groups of migrants, slum dwellers, indigenous communities, people living with disabilities, etc. To reach those people in sufficient number is very difficult to do in any consultation process. That's why we benefited from complementary things like the Participate project, which sat outside of the UN and was led by IDS and others, but they did much more in-depth work, with people directly over a longer time frame. And that was something that we couldn't do. And then I think the other critique was the process inclusive. You had countries, for the national consultations that followed really brilliant and innovative processes to make it as inclusive as possible. So they didn't restrict themselves to the urban areas, they took themselves out to the districts, they used radio, TV, drawing competitions, all sorts of different media. So where you had innovative and energetic UN country teams and RCs, it was as inclusive as it could be, certainly more inclusive than we'd seen before. But in some countries, to be frank, you just didn't have that. You had weak UN country teams, you had less energy, and so they did the bare minimum to show that they'd done an inclusive process. So was the 2015 design process inclusive? I think more so than ever before, but probably can still be learnt on and built on in the future.
Thanks, Paul. How familiar are you with the results of the My World 2015 survey, the UN system consultations, civil society consultations, or the UN Global Pulse Big Data tools? Have you participated, interacted, designed, or implemented any of these instruments? And were these results transparent and accessible, in your view?
So I'm aware of the majority of those. I have less knowledge on the Global Pulse Twitter scraping thing, although I know, quite a bit about it, but I know less about the methodology, etc. On all the others, I played a role in helping to design those structures. So the UN project that we led mobilized the resources for and created the guidance for and implemented all of the national consultations, the thematic consultations, and paid for the World We Want platform and the work that went into that. And then in addition to that, I had a role in designing and then analysing the My World data that came from that platform. What was the question, sorry? Were these transparent? Were they? Yeah, no, I felt that was quite a positive aspect of the process, in that every single piece of data, whether it came from the My World survey, whether it came from the more qualitative face-to-face meetings, all of that, there was a commitment to get that published online so that it could be reanalyzed by other people who could question, if you like, our summaries of it, or even do further work. So, starting with the My World data, the data set was online. You could disaggregate it by gender, by age, by country, by level of schooling. So if we were missing something as UN analysts, then someone else could come in, use the same data, and use it for their own purposes. And then for the qualitative data. It's more difficult analytically to pull that together, but nevertheless, all of the records of the meetings, all of the minutes of the meetings were online, and the World Wide Web platform went further in helping to provide analytical tools which could be used to, again, disaggregate that data by the extent to which certain keywords were mentioned, or certain countries were mentioned, or certain topics were mentioned. So I think, again, more so than any other process in the past, a real effort was made to be as transparent as possible about the outputs of the consultations.
So, do you think these results of the aforementioned tools were useful or easy to make sense of?
I think some more so than others, and I guess we can see which ones were used by the extent that they were brought into the intergovernmental process. So, we know, for example, and it comes up in our evaluation that we've done, that certain member states or blocks use the MyWorld data in the Open Working Group meetings. So particularly the EU using the vote on an open and honest and responsive government, for example. But there were other examples as well. I think in other cases as well, there was a line of influence from the consultations up to the final shape of the agenda, its goals and targets. But some of them are sort of more oblique and indirect. So I'll give another example. On the thematic consultations, of which there were 11, they covered not just the MDG topics, but some others, like governance and peace and security and demographic changes. The staff in the UN agencies that shepherded those consultations were the same staff that wrote the issues notes, which were crafted by the UN system, which resourced the Open Working Group meetings of governments. So even in a slightly indirect way, all of the themes and issues that came up in the consultations found their way into a technical briefing which was provided to governments. And one of the main reasons why this was possible was the sequencing. There's no point having a participatory, inclusive process that runs in parallel to decision making. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's no point in having a government meeting here and the participation is taking place at the same time, because it's not sequential enough to influence it. So for a consultation to be meaningful, all that participation needs to be front-loaded, because it needs to form a part of the agenda setting as well. So, starting the process that we did in 2011 was a way of ensuring that it would be sufficiently mature to influence the government meetings which would come later. And I think that's the mistake we often make in national and international policy making, is that we have these token consultations which may be participatory or not, but it's not all about participation, it's about strategy and sequencing so that they feed in at the right time.
Yeah, so you actually are touching on the next question, which it's asking if in your view, were these results presented in a timely manner to policymakers? And did they have any impact on the design of the post-2015 agenda? And do you think that the SDG proposal is actually inclusive?
So yes on the first two, because of what I said just now. Yes, I think they were timely because it started well before any sort of decisions were made by governments about what the agenda would look like. Were they influential? Yes. Again, particularly on certain issues, governance, inequalities, climate change. I think all of these things were strengthened in the agenda because of the consultations. I think the breadth of the agenda is a direct result of the consultations. And as Lard Pritchett would say, it's the end of sort of kinky development where a lot of money goes into a few things. What people highlighted when they were asked was that their world is complex and that the problems that they face are numerous and complex and integrated. And that's what you have in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. So is the outcome inclusive? Well, again, I think partly because the design process was inclusive, there's a strong call for the implementation phase to be inclusive as well. And there's a much higher degree of ownership in governments and civil society and elsewhere for the implementation. So again, I think in contrast to the MDGs, Agenda 2030 is an inclusive agenda. And it's also inclusive because of the principles that it describes in its design, i.e. universal in nature, covering all countries and all people, with the aspiration to leave no one behind, and to have data that can track progress for different groups. All of these, I think, are signals of inclusivity, right? Because it's basically applying to everybody. And I think it's inclusive also because the breadth of the goals and targets reflects much more of the existing commitments on human rights than the MDGs did. The MDGs covered a portion of the human rights agenda, but the SDGs almost cover the full extent of the human rights agenda, and that is, as we know, is universal too. So applying to every person, every country. So I think it's a good degree of inclusivity as of in design of the new agenda.
Did you feel as an individual represented during the SDG design process, and what could have been improved in terms of social participation during the design process of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs?
Well, I didn't see myself as a participant in the design process. I didn't seek to get my views heard on any particular issue. My role was as a general facilitator to improve the pathways for other people's voices to be heard. Now, what could have been improved? Well, lots of things. As I mentioned, we had patchy quality at the country level in terms of the national consultations. We provided resources, we provided guidance, but because we're based in New York and everyone else is based around the world, it's difficult to micromanage that process so that it's of level quality. To do that in a way that would have been better would have required more staff being engaged, having greater monitoring and evaluation in real time of what was going on at the country level. What else could have been better? I think it would have been slightly stronger to have a more formal demand from governments for the outputs of the consultations. Now, that's not to say that the outputs of the consultations didn't feed in and didn't influence governments, but in a way it was always knocking on the door and convincing them that this was information that would be useful to them. So I think if it had been formally built into the design that governments would listen to and request all of that consultation, then I think it would have been stronger in practice. But I must say, overall, whether it was by design or by luck, what happened was a process of consultation at various levels with some good degree of participation, which influenced the shape and outcome of the multilateral process. So as we've done our evaluation of this, what we've wanted to do is learn from it so that the next one can be better still. But I still think there's lots of positive things to take away from the last 4 years.
Thanks, Paul. Can you describe at least 2 examples of programs and/or policies designed to foster social inclusion and participation?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to give a bit more detail on the question.
So can you think of policies or programs, it could be at the national, at the global level, that were designed and intended to, as an outcome, foster social inclusion and participation, whether it's participation at the policy making or even at the implementation or of development policies or in the search of development?
This requires a lot more thought. It's not something that you can, because I don't know if this directly relates to the post-2015 process, or is this just generally in life, in development, in policy making?
Generally in life, if you could think of 2 examples that could resemble something, a program, a policy that was intended to do this. It could be an initiative. It could be that certainly a foundation. If you can think of any in particular that makes a strong case, that's okay too.
Well, I mean, there are. Yeah. It's I'll have to get back to you on this one. It's too big a question to ask if no one's prepared for it, right? I don't know if you're coming up with that in your other interviews or not, but it's.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fine. It's fine. It's part of the interview process, and definitely we would definitely like to have your perspectives after the fact. That's perfectly okay. No issue there. Can you describe at least two cases? And this one is similar to the last one. So again, if you can think of very tangible examples that you're familiar with, that's fine. We could add them on later. But can you describe at least two cases where inclusion and participation were decisive in the designing inclusive and successful public policies, aside from the Agenda 2030 design?
Yeah, again, it's one of those ones where you're probably going to get a bad answer if I force one now. But given time, I'll be able to think of things. Yeah.
Okay, and taking into account the lessons of the post-2015 design process, can you name at least 3 recommendations to foster inclusion and participation in specific terms around the implementation of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs?
So this is exclusively on implementation?
Yes.
Yeah, I know. I think countries have, those countries that are willing to do so have a huge opportunity to craft sort of more inclusive implementation processes. So one would be obviously replicating some of those outreach tools that have been used in the design process. So if you're national government A, you have the goals in front of you now, but you could go back to your population and you could ask them to say which ones were most important for them again. So you could get some sort of priority setting across those 17 goals by, asking your population. You could include people in a much more decisive way in the monitoring and evaluation, measurement process of whether progress is being made or not. And you could do that by, putting in place surveys or other tools that would get people's feedback on whether they think things are improving or not, or indeed where there are problems. And that could be a complementary set of information that would sit alongside the actual indicators that governments are committing to measure. And the third thing, of course, is that participation generally isn't cost-free. So it takes time and money to engender in a proper way. So governments and others can choose to allocate more resources towards paying for decent participation. And I think the trick is not seeing it as a sort of a deadweight cost. The trick is to see it as an investment in a set of information that helps you to do your job better. And I think if you start thinking about, if governments can start thinking about participation in that way, it's something that A, enables them to do their job better, and B, because their incentives are to stay in power because they're politicians, it enables them to stay in power longer because they're doing their job better, within a democratic setting. So I think, financial investment in participation, well thought through, culturally sensitive, well sequenced participation, and then actual mechanisms and tools like surveys, bringing people into the reporting process. All of these are very concrete things that governments could commit to now in implementation.
Thank you very much, Paul, for participating in this interview. The content of the interview will be a part of a qualitative analysis that includes other 19 respondents from various institutions and representing diverse actors in the international community. But this has been incredibly valuable. We look forward to hearing recommendations from you, and we like to thank you personally for participating. Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, no problem at all. Good luck with it, right?
Thanks.
Okay.